Hello, everyone, and welcome back to W-broux, where every story gets under your skin. Before you drift off into the night, I have a little request: leave a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. It's fascinating to see how our stories bring people together. If you're enjoying these chilling tales, don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling episodes. The cabin in the woods. I hadn't planned to rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere. The idea struck me during one of those restless nights, where the city felt stifling, and my apartment felt more like a cage than a home. Work had been overwhelming, and the constant noise of the city sirens, honking cars, people talking had started to wear me down. I needed quiet. I needed to get away. After hours of browsing, I found it. Secluded cabin for rent, the listing said. The photos showed a small wooden cabin nestled in the middle of a forest, miles away from anything. No neighbors, no roads nearby, just trees and peace. It was perfect. A place where I could spend a weekend, completely alone, with no one to bother me. I could read, maybe do some hiking, and just forget about the world for a few days. The owner's description said it was the ideal retreat for someone looking to escape. So I booked it. The drive out was longer than expected. The last hour was spent on a narrow dirt road, winding through dense woods. My GPS lost signal about halfway, but I wasn't worried. I had written down the directions. By the time I arrived, the sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was exactly like the photos. It was small, rustic, and charming in a way that made it seem like it had been sitting in the forest for 100 years, untouched by time. The wood was weathered, but the porch looked sturdy, and the windows gleamed in the fading light. I parked the car and stepped out, breathing in the crisp, fresh air. The silence was jarring at first. I had gotten so used to the constant noise of the city that the quiet felt unnatural, like the world had gone on pause. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant chirping of birds. It felt like I had stepped into a different world. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and headed inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and pine. The interior was simple, just one large room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a bed tucked into the corner. There were a few windows, each one offering a view of the surrounding trees. It was cozy, in a way that made me feel like I could finally relax. I spent the evening unpacking and settling in. I lit a fire in the fireplace as the sun disappeared behind the trees, and the room filled with a warm, flickering light. I opened a bottle of wine, poured myself a glass, and sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. It was perfect. The quiet, the isolation, it was everything I had hoped for. I sat there for hours, sipping wine and listening to the soft sounds of the forest. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen them, without the light pollution from the city. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. That night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that's uninterrupted by alarms or the sound of traffic. I woke up to the soft light of morning streaming through the windows. It was a cool, crisp day, and I made myself a cup of coffee, sitting on the porch again, wrapped in a blanket. Birds were chirping, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. For a while, I just sat there, enjoying the stillness. It felt surreal, being so far from everything. No phone calls, no emails, no people, just me in the cabin. I decided to go for a walk later, to explore the woods around the cabin and see what the trails were like. After breakfast, I grabbed a jacket and set out. There was a narrow trail that wound through the forest, leading deeper into the woods. The trees were tall and dense, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The air was cool and smelled of earth and pine. As I walked, the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful. But after about an hour of walking, that peace began to feel strange. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a vague feeling like the quiet had become too quiet, like I wasn't really alone. I stopped, looking around, but there was no one. Just the trees, standing silent and still. I shrugged it off and kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. It was as if the forest was watching me, like there were eyes hidden among the branches. I turned around and headed back toward the cabin, my steps quickening as the unease grew. By the time I reached the cabin, I was practically jogging. I locked the door behind me, feeling a little foolish for being spooked by nothing. But the feeling lingered, a gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. I tried to shake it off. I made lunch and sat by the fire, reading one of the books I had brought, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing up at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But there was no one, just trees. As the afternoon wore on, I started to feel more and more unsettled. It was hard to explain, but it was like the cabin had changed. The air inside felt heavy, and every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the windows, seemed too loud, too close. I kept glancing at the door, at the windows, feeling like I wasn't alone. Then I noticed it. A small black dot in the corner of the ceiling. I frowned, standing up and walking over to it. At first I thought it was a bug or a spot of dirt, but as I looked closer, I realized what it was: a camera. Tiny, almost invisible, but definitely a camera. It was pointed right at the living room. My heart skipped a beat. I backed away, my mind racing. Who had put this here? Why? I scanned the room, my eyes darting around, and that's when I saw another one, this time above the door, hidden in the shadows. I rushed into the bedroom. There, above the bed, was a third camera, its lens aimed directly at the pillow where I had slept the night before. Panic surged through me. Someone had been watching me. They had been watching me the entire time. I grabbed my phone, frantically trying to call for help, but there was no signal. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen, desperately hoping a call would go through, but it was useless. I hadn't thought to check for signal. When I arrived, I hadn't planned on using my phone much anyway. But now it felt like my only lifeline had been cut. I ran outside, thinking I could drive down the road until I found a signal. But when I reached my car, I froze. All 4 tires had been slashed. Deep gashes ran through the rubber, leaving the car completely unusable. Someone had been here. Someone had done this while I was inside the cabin. I stumbled back, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Who was watching me? Why would they slash my tires? I was miles from the nearest road, completely isolated. No phone, no car, and no way to contact anyone. I sprinted back inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. I grabbed the largest knife I could find from the kitchen drawer and backed into the corner of the living room, clutching the knife with trembling hands. I didn't know what else to do. For hours I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The light outside began to fade, and soon, the cabin was plunged into darkness. I hadn't turned on any lights. I didn't want whoever was out there to see where I was. I didn't want to make it easy for them. The quiet of the night, which had felt so peaceful the night before, now felt oppressive. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the wind brushing against the windows, felt magnified. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat, and I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. The footsteps were soft, barely audible, but I could hear them. Someone was walking around the cabin just outside. The footsteps stopped. Silence. And then, a knock. Soft at first, but then louder. Whoever it was, they wanted me to open the door. I didn't move. I couldn't. The knock came again, more insistent this time. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The knocking stopped, but I could hear breathing on the other side of the door. Slow, calm breathing, as if they were waiting for me. The footsteps started again, circling the cabin, getting closer and closer to the windows. I crept to the window, peeking through the edge of the curtain, and that's when I saw them. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line, watching the cabin. Watching me. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. I was trapped. My car was useless, my phone had no signal, and whoever was out there wasn't going away. I backed into the bedroom, locking the door behind me, even though I knew it wouldn't stop them if they wanted to get in. 4 hours I sat there, clutching the knife, listening to the footsteps outside. They were slow, methodical, circling the cabin again and again. Each time I thought they had left, they came back. It was like they were toying with me, waiting for me to make a move. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I grabbed my bag, sprinted out the door, and didn't stop running until I reached the main road. I flagged down the first car I saw, and the driver let me use their phone to call the police. When we returned to the cabin later that morning, the cameras were gone. The tires on my car were still slashed, but there was no sign of the person who had been outside. The police didn't find anything, and they told me it was probably just some prank. But I knew better. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been outside that cabin, and they were waiting for me to let them in. It was late, later than I had planned to be on the road, but I was almost home. The highway stretched ahead of me, an empty ribbon cutting through the dark countryside. The radio crackled with static, barely picking up a signal, so I turned it off. I rolled the windows down just enough to let the cool night air in, hoping it would keep me awake. I wasn't far from home, another hour or two at most. The drive had been long, but I wasn't in a hurry. The road was quiet, with hardly another car in sight. Just me and the stars overhead, twinkling faintly in the black sky. It was peaceful, almost calming, and I found my thoughts drifting. It must have been close to midnight when I saw him. A figure standing on the side of the road just beyond the bend. He was tall, wearing jeans and a jacket, his arm raised with his thumb out. A hitchhiker. I hadn't seen a hitchhiker in years. Most people don't pick them up anymore, it's just not something you do. But out here, in the middle of nowhere on an empty stretch of highway, it felt different. He looked normal enough, just a guy trying to get somewhere. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating him as I approached. He didn't look threatening, just tired. I debated for a moment, my hand hovering over the steering wheel, but something in me, a sense of guilt, maybe made me stop. I pulled over a few feet ahead of him and waited as he jogged up to the car. He opened the passenger door and smiled. It wasn't a big smile, more like a polite gesture, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, man," he said, sliding into the seat. "Not many people stop anymore." "Yeah, I guess it's not as common these days," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road a bit." "Anywhere you're going is good enough for me." I nodded and pulled back onto the road. The car was silent for a few minutes, neither of us speaking. It wasn't awkward, exactly, just quiet. He stared out the window, tapping his fingers on his knee in a slow, steady rhythm. After a while, I glanced over at him. He looked worn out, like he'd been walking for hours. His hair was messy, and there was dirt on his shoes, but nothing about him seemed out of place. Still, something about the situation made me uneasy. I wasn't sure what it was, but the longer we drove, the more I felt a sense of something off, like the air in the car had changed. So he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "You pick up hitchhikers often." "Not really," I admitted. "First time, actually." He chuckled, a low, quiet sound that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. "First time, huh? Must be my lucky night." I forced a smile but didn't say anything. Something about the way he said that rubbed me the wrong way, but I brushed it off. It was late, I was tired, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. We drove in silence for a few more miles, the road stretching endlessly ahead of us. Every now and then, I'd glance at him out of the corner of my eye, but he didn't move. He just stared out the window, his fingers still tapping that slow rhythm on his knee. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke again. "You ever meet someone and just know they've done bad things?" I turned to him, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, still staring straight ahead, you know. "Some people you can just tell. They've hurt people, killed people, maybe." My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to play it off. "I guess I don't really think about it." He chuckled again, that same low sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Yeah, most people don't. But I can always tell." I swallowed hard, my eyes fixed on the road. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel as a sense of unease settled over me. There was something about him, something in the way he talked, that didn't sit right with me. The silence in the car stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. I wanted to say something, anything to break it, but the words wouldn't come. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he had just said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake by picking him up. He spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You ever do something you regret?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. He turned to look at me, his gaze heavy and unsettling. "Never hurt someone? Never thought about it?" I swallowed, my throat dry. "No." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, not even once. I shook my head again, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel his eyes on me, feel the weight of his stare. I kept my gaze fixed on the road, trying to act like I wasn't freaked out, but inside I was panicking. "I have," he said, almost casually. My heart stopped. "I didn't mean to." At first he continued, his voice low and steady. "But things got out of hand. You know how it is." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. He kept talking, as if he hadn't just said something that made my blood run cold. It was a few years ago. Some guy at a bar. He was mouthing off, saying things he shouldn't have. I didn't mean to hurt him, not really. I just wanted him to shut up. But things got out of hand. My mouth was dry, and my hands were trembling on the wheel. "What? What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. He didn't make it. Cops never found out. It's not hard to hide something like that if you know what you're doing. My stomach twisted, and I forced myself to swallow the lump in my throat. I didn't know what to say. Was he serious? Was he just messing with me? Either way, I was stuck in the car with him, and there was nowhere to go. He turned to look at me again, his eyes dark and unreadable. You ever wonder what it's like to take someone's life? No, I said quickly, my voice shaky. He smiled again, that cold, empty smile. It's not like in the movies. It's messy, louder. But once you do it, it gets easier. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and I could barely focus on the road. I wanted to pull over, kick him out of the car, but I was too scared. What if he had a weapon? What if he tried to hurt me? The road ahead was dark and empty, stretching on for miles with no sign of civilization. I was trapped. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of his jacket as he shifted in his seat. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, but every scenario ended the same. I couldn't get away from him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance. A small gas station, barely more than a couple of pumps, and a rundown convenience store. My heart leaped into my throat. I slowed the car, pulling into the parking lot, and parked near the entrance. I need to get gas, I said, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his smile fading. I thought you had a full tank. I swallowed hard, trying to think of an excuse. I just want to top it off, just in case. He stared at me for a moment, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, after what felt like forever, he shrugged and opened the door. All right, he said, climbing out of the car. Thanks for the ride. I didn't respond. I just nodded, watching as he closed the door behind him and walked toward the convenience store. He stood there for a moment, staring at me through the window, his face expressionless, before turning and disappearing into the shadows behind the building. I sat there for a long time, my hands still gripping the wheel, my heart racing in my chest. I watched the door to the convenience store, waiting for him to come back, but he didn't. The gas station attendant was staring at me through the window, probably wondering why I wasn't getting out of the car. Finally, I moved. I got out of the car, my legs shaking as I walked to the pump. I filled up the tank, my eyes darting to the shadows every few seconds, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. But he was gone. I paid for the gas, got back into the car, and drove away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't stop driving until I was miles down the road, far enough away that I was sure he couldn't catch up to me. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting. I never picked up a hitchhiker again after that, and I never will. It had been hours since we'd left the interstate, and I was beginning to regret our decision to take the scenic route. What was supposed to be a beautiful, rural drive had turned into a seemingly endless stretch of desolate farmland. My girlfriend, Sarah, sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the fields blurred by. We hadn't seen another car in miles, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. Maybe we should stop and ask for directions, she suggested, glancing over at me. We're not lost, but we're definitely not where we thought we'd be. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I didn't want to admit that I had no idea where we were, but the truth was, I was starting to feel uneasy. The GPS had lost signal hours ago, and there were no signs of civilization, no gas stations, no stores, just acres of empty farmland. It felt like we were driving into nowhere. Up ahead, a small dirt road branched off from the highway, leading toward what looked like a farmhouse in the distance. It was the first sign of life we'd seen in hours, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to stop and ask for directions. I'll pull over there, I said, nodding toward the farmhouse. Maybe someone can help us get back on track. Sarah hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the house. Are you sure? It looks kind of. Old. I shrugged. We don't have many options. Besides, we need directions. Reluctantly, she nodded, and I turned down the dirt road, the car bumping along the uneven surface. As we approached the farmhouse, I could see that it was even older than it had appeared from a distance. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dark, but there was a light on inside, flickering faintly through the curtains. A battered old truck sat in the driveway, its tires caked with mud. I parked the car and killed the engine. For a moment we sat in silence, both of us staring at the house. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, her voice uncertain. "It'll be fine," I said, though I didn't feel as confident as I sounded. "I'll just ask for directions, and we'll be back on the road in no time." I opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air. The wind had picked up, rustling the tall grass that surrounded the farmhouse. The sun had nearly disappeared, casting long shadows across the yard. I walked up to the front porch, the wood creaking under my feet, and knocked on the door. For a long time, there was no response. I glanced back at Sarah, who was still sitting in the car, watching me. I was about to knock again when I heard footsteps from inside the house. The door creaked open a few inches, and a man's face appeared in the gap. He was old, probably in his 70s, with a weathered face and sunken eyes. His thinning white hair was disheveled, and he wore a dirty flannel shirt that hung loosely on his thin frame. He looked at me with suspicion, his eyes narrowing as he took in my appearance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough and raspy. Yeah, I said, trying to sound friendly. "We're kind of lost. Our GPS stopped working, and we were hoping you could point us in the right direction." The old man stared at me for a long moment, his eyes scanning me from head to toe. Then he glanced past me at the car, where Sarah was sitting. His eyes lingered on her for a moment before he finally spoke. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "We're trying to get back to the highway," I said. "We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere." The old man nodded slowly, then opened the door a little wider. "You'd better come inside. It's getting dark. I'll give you directions." I hesitated, glancing back at the car. Sarah was watching me with wide eyes, her expression nervous. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of going into the house, but I didn't want to be rude. Besides, we needed the directions. "Okay, thanks," I said. I motioned for Sarah to come with me, but she shook her head, mouthing, "I'll wait here," I nodded, understanding her hesitation. I turned back toward the old man, who was still holding the door open, and stepped inside. The interior of the house was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small, flickering lamp on a table in the corner. The air smelled musty, like the house hadn't been aired out in years. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floor creaked under my feet as I walked. The living room was cluttered with old furniture, dusty books, and piles of newspapers stacked haphazardly against the walls. "Sit down," the old man said, gesturing to a worn-out armchair. "I'll get you those directions." I sat down, feeling the springs of the chair sag under my weight. The old man disappeared into another room, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the wind rattling the windows. I glanced around, my eyes lingering on the old photographs that lined the walls. Most of them were black and white, faded with age, and they showed a family, parents, children, and what looked like the old man when he was younger. There was something unsettling about the photos, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. A few minutes passed, and I began to feel uneasy. The old man still hadn't returned, and the silence in the house was oppressive. I was about to get up and leave when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see the old man standing in the doorway, holding a piece of paper. "Got your directions right here," he said, walking over and handing me the paper. "Thanks," I said, taking the paper from him. I glanced at the directions, but something about them didn't make sense. They were vague, almost nonsensical. "Turn left at the oak tree, right at the barn, follow the road until you see the fence." It felt like the kind of directions someone would give to send you on a wild goose chase. I looked up at the old man, who was watching me with an unreadable expression. I don't mean to be rude, but these directions, I'm not sure they'll get us where we need to go." The old man's eyes narrowed. "Those directions will get you where you need to go," he said, his voice low and firm. I hesitated, glancing back at the door. My gut was telling me that something wasn't right, that I needed to get out of there. "Well, I should get going," I said, standing up. "Thanks for the help." The old man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with those cold, sunken eyes. I hurried to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped outside. Sarah was still in the car, her eyes wide with worry. I walked quickly over to her, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the car. "What took so long?" she asked, her voice shaky. "The directions he gave me don't make any sense," I said, glancing down at the paper in my hand. "We're just going to have to figure it out on our own." I backed the car out of the driveway and pulled back onto the dirt road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As we drove away from the farmhouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Did he seem strange to you?" Sarah asked after a few minutes of silence. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, something about him wasn't right." We drove in silence for a while, the dirt road stretching on in front of us. The sky had grown darker, and the wind had picked up, whipping through the trees that lined the road. I glanced down at the directions the old man had given me, but they still didn't make sense. It was as if they were designed to get us lost. "Let me see those," Sarah said, reaching for the paper. I handed it to her, keeping my eyes on the road. She studied the directions for a few moments, her brow furrowing in confusion. "This doesn't make any sense," she said, shaking her head. "Turn left at the oak tree?" "What oak tree? We haven't passed a single tree that stands out." I know, I muttered. "It's like you wanted us to get lost." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. What if he did? I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there, and fast. As we drove, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs of civilization in sight. The wind howled through the trees, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. I felt a growing sense of dread, like we were being swallowed by the night. Suddenly, the car sputtered and lurched, the engine making a strange grinding noise. I cursed under my breath and pulled over to the side of the road. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. "I don't know," I said, my heart racing. "The engine's acting up." I turned off the car and sat there for a moment, trying to calm myself down. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing with thoughts of the old man and his strange directions. "I'll check the engine," I said, opening the door and stepping out into the cold night air. The wind whipped around me as I popped the hood and peered inside. I wasn't much of a mechanic, but even I could tell that something was wrong. The engine was smoking, and there was a strange smell coming from it, like something had burned out. I slammed the hood shut and leaned against the car, my heart pounding in my chest. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no idea where we were. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, running a hand through my hair. "We can't stay here. We'll have to walk." "Walk where?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "We don't even know where we are." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. There's got to be something up ahead. Another house, a gas station, something. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't argue. We grabbed our jackets and started walking down the road, the wind howling around us. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After what felt like hours, we saw something up ahead, a faint light flickering in the distance. My heart leaped in my chest. Maybe it was a gas station or another farmhouse, somewhere we could get help. As we got closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't a gas station or a different house. It was the farmhouse we had just left, the same light flickering faintly in the window. We had been walking in circles. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just a place to rest my head for a few hours before I got back on the road. I had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight, my eyes blurry with exhaustion, and I knew I couldn't go any further without some sleep. The road had become a dark, winding blur through the forest, and the rain wasn't helping. The windshield wipers were barely keeping up, smearing the rain rather than clearing it. The yellow beams of my headlights flickered weakly against the downpour, casting only enough light to make out the sign for a motel up ahead. The place was run down and dimly lit, a neon vacancy sign flickering in the window. I hesitated, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel as I debated whether to stop here. The motel looked like the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, isolated, with a weather-beaten exterior and a parking lot full of puddles from the rain. But I didn't have a choice. I was too tired to keep driving, and this was the first place I had seen for miles. I pulled into the parking lot, my tires splashing through the shallow puddles, and parked near the entrance. The building was a long, single-story structure with a series of doors that led to individual rooms. Each door had a faded number painted on it, barely visible in the dim light from the single bulb that hung above the entrance. I turned off the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the building. The rain was still coming down in sheets, drumming against the roof of the car, and I could see the faint glow of a television flickering through the curtains of one of the rooms. Someone else was staying here, at least. With a sigh, I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and opened the door. The cold rain hit me immediately, soaking through my clothes as I hurried toward the entrance. The office was small, barely more than a desk and a few old chairs, with a man sitting behind the counter. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes narrowing, as if he hadn't expected anyone to show up this late. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah," I replied, shaking the rain from my jacket. "Just for the night." He grunted and reached for a set of keys hanging on the wall behind him. "Room 12. It's $50 for the night. Cash only." I dug into my wallet and handed him the money, trying not to think about how sketchy the place seemed. At this point, I didn't care. I just needed to sleep. He handed me the key, and I nodded, thanking him before heading back out into the rain. Room 12 was near the far end of the building, and I walked quickly, the cold water seeping into my shoes as I splashed through the puddles. The door was old, the paint peeling, and the number barely visible on the wood. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was about what I had expected. Dingy, with faded wallpaper and a musty smell that made me wrinkle my nose. There was a bed in the center of the room, covered with an old floral bedspread, and a small television sitting on a dresser across from it. A single lamp cast a weak glow over the room, making the shadows in the corners seem even darker. I dropped my bag on the bed and sat down, rubbing my eyes. I was too tired to care about the condition of the room. I kicked off my shoes and lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling as I listened to the rain hammering against the window. The sound was almost soothing, and I felt myself drifting off within minutes. I must have been asleep for a few hours when something woke me. It wasn't a loud noise, more like a faint creak, like the sound of someone stepping lightly across the floor. I blinked, still groggy from sleep, and sat up, rubbing my eyes. The room was dark, the lamp flickering weakly beside the bed, casting long shadows across the walls. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the sound. Maybe it was just the building settling or the wind rattling the windows. But then I heard it again, a soft, barely audible creak, like the sound of a door opening slowly. My heart began to race as I looked around the room. The door to the bathroom was slightly ajar, and I could have sworn it had been closed when I went to sleep. I stared at it, my pulse quickening, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that maybe the draft from the rainstorm had pushed it open. But then I heard another sound, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the wall. Someone was in the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen. The room was silent now, save for the rain still beating against the window. But I knew what I had heard. There was someone else in the room with me. I slowly swung my legs off the bed, trying to move as quietly as possible. My mind was racing. Should I turn on the light? Should I make a run for the door? My fingers brushed against the edge of the nightstand, and I felt around until I found my phone. I turned it on, the screen casting a faint glow over the room. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't see anyone. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should have been, but there was no movement, no sign of another person. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that I was still half asleep and imagining things. But then I heard it again, this time louder. The unmistakable sound of someone breathing. I shot to my feet, my pulse racing. I grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, holding it like a weapon as I backed toward the door. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the sound, but the room was still, the shadows unmoving. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the corner near the bathroom door, barely visible in the dim light. My heart stopped as I realized that whoever it was, they had been standing there the entire time, watching me. The figure was tall, their face obscured by the shadows, but I could see the outline of their body, the way they were standing perfectly still, as if waiting for me to notice them. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and running out into the rain without looking back. My shoes splashed through the puddles as I sprinted toward my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, and sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the motel room, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, but the door remained closed, the room dark and still. I didn't wait to find out if they would follow me. I jammed the key into the ignition, started the car, and tore out of the parking lot, the tires skidding on the wet pavement as I sped down the highway. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, the motel far behind me, that I realized I was still clutching the lamp from the room. My knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly, and my hands were shaking as I set it down on the passenger seat. I didn't stop driving until the sun began to rise, the dark clouds of the night giving way to the faint pink light of dawn. By the time I pulled over at a gas station, my body was trembling with exhaustion, but I couldn't bring myself to rest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching me. I never went back to that motel. I never even tried to find out what had happened that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been in that room with me hadn't been there by accident. They had been waiting for me. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive. I was heading home after visiting my family for the weekend, and the drive, though long, had always been easy enough. The route was familiar through the countryside, then onto a long stretch of highway bordered by dense woods. I'd driven it dozens of times, and despite the lateness of the hour, I wasn't worried. I liked night drives. They were peaceful, calming, a time to think. That night, though, something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a heaviness in the air. The sky was a dull gray, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The trees lining the highway seemed taller, darker than usual, their branches stretching overhead like claws reaching for the sky. It was late past midnight and the highway was completely deserted. I hadn't seen another car for miles, just the endless road stretching out in front of me, disappearing into the darkness. I turned on the radio, but all I could find was static. My phone had no signal either, which wasn't surprising given how remote the area was, but it added to the sense of isolation that had been creeping in as the night wore on. I glanced at the dashboard. I still had a few hours of driving ahead of me, but my eyelids were growing heavy and I knew I needed to rest. The last thing I wanted was to fall asleep at the wheel. I was just starting to debate whether I should pull over when I saw a rest stop sign, illuminated by my headlights as I passed it. Rest stop 1 mile. I sighed with relief. I could stop, stretch my legs, maybe grab a nap before continuing on. The rest stop would be empty at this hour, and that sounded perfect to me. A quick break, then back on the road. The road ahead was dark, but soon I saw the faint glow of the rest stop lights in the distance. As I pulled off the highway and into the parking lot, I noticed how quiet everything was. The lot was deserted, as I had expected, and the building a small, shabby structure with a couple of vending machines and restrooms stood in the center, its lights flickering faintly. I parked near the edge of the lot, under a dim street lamp. The bulb buzzed softly, casting a weak, yellowish glow over the car. I killed the engine and leaned back in my seat, stretching out my legs. The silence outside was thick, almost oppressive. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional hum of a truck engine in the distance. I closed my eyes for a moment, thinking I could catch a quick nap. Just 20 minutes, I told myself. But as soon as I shut my eyes, I heard a faint sound, like a low hum or a whisper, carried on the wind. I opened my eyes and sat up, scanning the parking lot. There was nothing there, just the empty rows of parking spaces and the faint glow of the street lamp. The rest stop was completely deserted, exactly as it had been when I pulled in. I shook my head, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was creeping up my spine. I was tired, that was all. The long drive, the late hour was starting to get to me. I just needed to stretch my legs. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The wind had picked up, tugging at my jacket as I walked toward the rest stop building. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. The vending machines hummed softly, but there was no other sound. I made my way to the restroom, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The rest stop felt different now, more isolated, more unsettling. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about the place that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Inside the restroom, the lights buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the walls were cracked, the tiles stained with age. I washed my hands quickly, eager to get back to my car, but as I dried my hands on the paper towel, I heard the door creak open behind me. I froze, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror. I hadn't heard anyone else pull in, hadn't seen another car, but someone was there. I could feel their presence behind me. Slowly, I turned around, half expecting to see another traveler, maybe a trucker stopping for a break. But when I turned, the restroom was empty. The door was still slightly ajar, swinging softly on its hinges, but there was no one there. My heart began to race, and I took a step back, my eyes darting around the small space. I was alone. I had been alone the whole time. I hurried to the door, pushing it open, and stepped outside, glancing around the parking lot. It was still empty. I walked quickly back to my car, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. I needed to get out of here. I'd had my break, I was awake now. I didn't need to rest anymore. I just needed to get back on the road, away from this place. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I let out a shaky breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the glow of the street lamp, was a figure. They were tall, their face obscured by shadows, but I could see the outline of their body, standing perfectly still, watching me. I slammed my foot on the gas, my heart racing as I sped out of the rest stop and back onto the highway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if the figure was still there, watching me from the darkness. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The image of the figure standing in the parking lot was burned into my mind, and no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, following me. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was just another traveler, someone stopping for a break just like I had. But something about the figure had been wrong. They hadn't moved, hadn't reacted when I drove away. They had just stood there, perfectly still, watching. As the minutes ticked by, I began to feel more at ease. The highway was empty, just me and the road, and the rest stop was miles behind me now. I let out a long breath, forcing myself to relax. And then I saw them again. A figure, standing on the side of the road, just ahead of me. My heart leaped into my throat as I recognized the silhouette. It was the same figure I had seen at the rest stop, tall, unmoving, their face hidden in shadow. I swerved to avoid them, my tires skidding on the wet pavement as I veered back onto the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. Panic surged through me. I wasn't imagining it. I had seen them. I had almost hit them. I kept driving, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop. Not again. The road stretched on, winding through the trees, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The clouds overhead had thickened, and the rain had started to fall harder, drumming against the roof of the car. I could barely see the road in front of me, but I didn't dare slow down. Then, through the rain, I saw them again. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, directly in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure stood there, unmoving, their face still obscured by the shadows. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at them through the rain-soaked windshield, too terrified to move. Then, slowly, they took a step forward. I threw the car into reverse, my foot slamming down on the gas pedal as I backed away from the figure. The tires screeched on the wet pavement, and the car lurched backward. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, watching me, their face hidden in the darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned the car around and sped back down the highway, the rain blurring the road in front of me. I didn't care where I was going, I just had to get away. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that they were still there, watching me from the shadows. I drove for what felt like hours, the rain never letting up, the road stretching endlessly in front of me. I didn't know where I was anymore. The highway signs had become a blur. and the trees lining the road all looked the same. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, and no matter how far I drove, I couldn't. Wake up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance. A town, civilization. Relief washed over me as I sped toward it, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I needed to get off the highway, away from the darkness and the rain. I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town, parking under the bright lights. My body was trembling with exhaustion and fear, and I felt like I could collapse at any moment. But I was safe now. I had made it. I sat there for a long time, my head resting against the steering wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. The bright lights of the gas station felt like a lifeline, pulling me out of the nightmare I had just experienced. But when I finally looked up, my heart froze in my chest. There, standing at the edge of the gas station parking lot, just beyond the glow of the lights, was the figure. They were still watching me. After a string of exhausting work weeks, I decided it was time to get away for a bit. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere I could relax and unplug from the chaos of my daily life. A cozy, secluded getaway sounded like just the thing. A quick search on Airbnb led me to the perfect place, a charming little house just outside a small, picturesque town nestled in the woods. The listing was everything I could have hoped for a quaint, rustic cottage with all the modern amenities, surrounded by nature, and most importantly, no neighbors for miles. The photos showed a beautifully maintained house with a wraparound porch, large windows, and a wood-burning stove for chilly nights. The reviews were glowing, each one mentioning how friendly and accommodating the host was, and how peaceful and tranquil the area felt. I booked it immediately. The drive out was long but scenic. I watched the city disappear in my rearview mirror as I drove through rolling hills and dense forests. The road narrowed as I got closer to the house, eventually turning into a dirt path that wound through the trees. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. The house was even more beautiful in person. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, with ivy climbing up the stone walls and a small garden out front. The porch light was on, and a faint glow from the windows made the place look warm and inviting. I parked the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp, fresh air. The silence was immediate and absolute. No sounds of traffic, no voices, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It was exactly what I needed. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and made my way to the front door. The host, a man named Bill, had messaged me earlier in the day to let me know he'd left the key under the mat. Sure enough, there it was. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior of the house was just as charming as the outside. The living room was cozy, with a large stone fireplace and a comfy-looking couch. The kitchen was small but well-equipped, and the bedroom, tucked away in the back, looked like the perfect place to curl up and sleep the weekend away. As I wandered through the house, I noticed small touches that made the place feel lived in: fresh flowers on the kitchen table, a stack of firewood by the hearth, and a few well-worn books on a shelf near the window. It was clear that Bill took pride in maintaining the house and making sure his guests felt at home. I settled in quickly, unpacking my things and making a cup of tea. I had a book I'd been meaning to read for ages, and I figured this was the perfect place to finally crack it open. I spent the first evening curled up on the couch, listening to the crackle of the fire and the wind whispering through the trees outside. The quiet was soothing, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally relax. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft, golden glow over the room. I stretched and yawned, feeling more rested than I had in weeks. The bed was incredibly comfortable, and I hadn't slept that well in ages. I made myself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and crisp, and the forest surrounding the house was still and peaceful. I could hear the distant sound of a stream trickling somewhere nearby, and for a moment I stood there, soaking in the serenity. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed something odd. There was a small door at the far end of the porch, almost hidden behind a stack of firewood. I hadn't noticed it when I arrived, and it seemed a little out of place. Curious, I walked over and pulled the firewood aside, revealing the door. It was old and weathered, with a rusted padlock hanging from a latch. The Airbnb listing hadn't mentioned anything about a second entrance or a basement. I assumed it led to a crawl space or storage area, and since it was locked, I didn't give it much thought. I made a mental note to ask Bill about it later and went back inside to make breakfast. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I spent most of it lounging around the house, reading and taking short walks through the woods. It was the kind of peaceful retreat I had been craving. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I found myself feeling uneasy. There was no real reason for it, just a creeping sense of discomfort that settled over me as the sky grew darker. The silence that had felt so peaceful during the day now felt oppressive, almost suffocating. I tried to brush it off as nothing more than my imagination, but the feeling lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint noise, a soft creak, like the sound of a door opening slowly. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up, straining to listen. The house was still, the only sound the wind brushing against the windows. I waited, my ears straining for any other sound, but after a few moments there was nothing. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. After all, it was an old house, and old houses made noise. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay back down, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I woke feeling groggy and unsettled. I couldn't stop thinking about the noise I had heard the night before, and the creeping sense of unease that had settled over me hadn't gone away. I decided to go into town for the day, thinking a change of scenery might help shake off the weird vibe. The town was small, with a few shops and a diner, and I spent the afternoon wandering through the little boutiques and sipping coffee at the diner's counter. As I was paying for my meal, I struck up a conversation with the woman behind the counter, an older lady with kind eyes and a warm smile. "You staying nearby?" she asked as she handed me my change. "Yeah, I rented a place just outside of town," I replied. "A little cottage in the woods. It's beautiful." The woman's smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough to catch my attention. "You must mean Bill's place," she said, her tone careful. I nodded, surprised she knew the place. "Yeah, that's the one. Have you been there?" She hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. "No, I haven't. But people around here know about it." I frowned. "Know about it? What do you mean?" The woman glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening, before leaning in a little closer. "Bill's family has owned that property for generations. It's a nice place, but there's been talk. Some say it's haunted. Strange things happen there sometimes." My stomach tightened, and I forced a laugh. "Haunted? Really?" She gave me a serious look. "I don't know if it's true or not, but people have stayed there and, well, not everyone has had a good experience." The unease that had been gnawing at me for the past day flared up again, and I shifted uncomfortably. "Like what?" The woman hesitated again, clearly torn between saying too much and saying nothing. Finally, she sighed. People say they hear things, see things. Some folks claim there's a room in the house that's off limits, locked up tight. I don't know much else, but if I were you, I'd be careful. I left the diner feeling rattled. The noise I'd heard the night before echoed in my mind, and the woman's words swirled around in my thoughts. I tried to tell myself it was just superstition, local rumors meant to spook tourists. But the feeling of dread only deepened as I drove back to the cottage. When I arrived back at the house, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the porch. I stared at the small door at the far end of the porch, the one I had discovered the day before. My mind raced with questions. Why hadn't Bill mentioned the locked door? What was behind it? Determined to get some answers, I messaged Bill, asking him about the door. It took him a while to reply, but when he did, his response was short and vague. It's just an old storage room. Nothing to worry about, Dot. I stared at the message for a long moment, my stomach twisting. Something about the way he worded it felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but my mind was racing. The unease had settled into something darker now, something closer to fear. And then, just like the night before, I heard the sound of a door creaking open. This time, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. The house was still, but the noise had been real. I knew it had. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slipping out of bed as quietly as I could. I tiptoed through the house, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floors, and made my way toward the porch. The door at the far end of the porch was ajar. My blood ran cold. I was sure it had been locked when I checked it earlier. I approached the door slowly, the beam of light from my phone trembling in my hand. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open the rest of the way, revealing a set of narrow wooden stairs leading down into darkness. A basement. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, fear clawing at my insides. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to lock the door, to get out of the house. But something pulled me forward, curiosity, fear. I didn't know. I had to know what was down there. I descended the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. When I reached the bottom, the light from my phone illuminated a small, dirt-floored room. There were shelves lining the walls, cluttered with old tools and dusty boxes. And in the center of the room was a large wooden crate, its lid partially open. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. The crate was old, the wood rotting in places, and I could see something inside, something dark and shadowy. My hands trembled as I reached out and lifted the lid. Inside the crate were photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They were old, black and white pictures of people, families, couples, children. All of them were staring directly at the camera, their expressions frozen in place, but there was something wrong with their eyes. They were all empty, lifeless. I dropped the lid, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to get out. I turned to run, but as I did, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, moving through the house. Someone else was in the house. Moving to a new house was supposed to be a fresh start. My wife, Emily, and I had been searching for a place that was quieter, somewhere we could build our life away from the chaos of the city. When we found the house, a charming two-story cottage on a quiet suburban street, it felt like fate. It wasn't far from the edge of town, where the streets gave way to open fields and the occasional cluster of trees. It had everything we wanted: a nice yard, spacious rooms, and plenty of sunlight streaming through the windows. The move itself had gone smoothly enough. We spent the first few days unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting used to the new place. Everything seemed perfect until we met the neighbor. I first noticed him while Emily and I were sitting on the porch, taking a break from unpacking boxes. It was late afternoon, and the sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood. I had been sipping my coffee when I saw him, a man standing across the street, in the front yard of the house, directly opposite ours. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at our house. I nudged Emily and nodded toward the man. "Do you think he's watching us?" She followed my gaze, squinting against the sunlight. "Maybe he's just curious. We're the new people on the block." "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, but something about the way he was standing there, motionless, unsettled me. I raised my hand in a casual wave, trying to be friendly, but the man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring. Emily shrugged it off and went back inside to unpack more boxes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man was still standing there when I finally got up and went inside. Over the next few days, I tried not to think too much about the man across the street. Maybe he was just a little odd, I reasoned. Every neighborhood has that one person who keeps to themselves, the sort of person who doesn't socialize much. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy every time I caught a glimpse of him. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge. Every morning when I left the house to head to work, he was there standing in his front yard, watching me as I got into my car. And every evening when I returned home, he was in the same spot, staring silently at our house. It wasn't like he was out doing yard work or standing by his mailbox like a normal neighbor. He never moved. He just stood there, as if he had nothing else to do but watch. It was creepy, and Emily noticed it too. "Do you think we should say something?" she asked one evening as we sat on the porch again, our eyes drifting across the street to where he stood. Like what I asked. What do you say to someone who just stands there all day? "I don't know, but it's weird. He doesn't talk to anyone. I haven't seen him leave the house once." I nodded in agreement. There was something about him that made my skin crawl. It was more than just the fact that he was always watching us. It was the way he did it, completely still, never blinking, as if he was waiting for something. A week passed, and the staring didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. One night, after dinner, I went to take out the trash. The sun had already set, and the street was bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. I walked down the driveway with the trash bag in hand, and as I approached the curb, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of his driveway, closer than he had ever been before. The distance between our houses felt uncomfortably small in that moment, and my heart pounded in my chest. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but I could see his eyes, cold, unblinking, fixed on me. I froze, the trash bag dangling from my hand. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. Should I say something? Confront him? But the intensity of his gaze made me hesitate. There was something almost predatory about the way he was watching me. I forced myself to move, tossing the trash into the bin and turning back toward the house. My skin prickled, and I could feel his eyes on me the entire time, like a physical weight pressing down on my back. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. When I told Emily about it, she looked concerned. "We should call someone," she said. The police, maybe? I don't know. This isn't normal. I shook my head. What are we going to say? That the guy across the street is standing in his yard. That's not illegal. Creepy, sure, but not illegal. Emily didn't argue, but I could see the worry in her eyes. We both knew something wasn't right. The next night, things escalated. I woke up in the middle of the night, the house eerily silent. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me, but then I heard it a soft tap, 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 like the sound of something tapping against glass. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The room was dark, but the moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting faint shadows across the walls. I listened, holding my breath. There it was again. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced over at Emily, but she was still asleep, her breathing deep and even. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The tapping was coming from downstairs. My throat tightened as I made my way down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as if someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the living room, where the sound seemed to be coming from. My pulse quickened as I approached the window, the tapping now louder, more insistent. And then I saw him. The man from across the street was standing outside our window, his face pressed against the glass. His breath fogged up the pane, and his hand was raised, fingers tapping softly against the window. For a moment I was frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Why was he here? Why was he staring into our house in the middle of the night? My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back, my hand fumbling for the light switch. The room flooded with light, and for a split second, I saw his eyes cold, empty, staring directly into mine. Then he was gone. He disappeared so quickly, it was almost like he had never been there. One moment, his face was pressed against the glass, and the next, the window was empty, the yard beyond it dark and still. I stood there, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I rushed to the window, my eyes scanning the yard for any sign of him, but there was nothing. He was gone. I locked every door and window in the house that night. When Emily woke up, I told her what had happened, and her face went pale. "We have to call the police," she said, her voice shaking. "He was outside our house, looking in. He's dangerous." The police arrived within the hour, but there was little they could do. They took our statements, but without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could act on. The officer who spoke to us seemed sympathetic, but also somewhat skeptical. "You didn't actually see him do anything, right?" he asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. I shook my head. No, but he was standing right there, staring into our house. The officer sighed and glanced over at his partner. "Look, we'll talk to him, but unless he's actually trespassing or causing harm, there's not much we can do. It's his property, and technically, he hasn't done anything illegal." Emily and I were frustrated, but we understood. The man was strange, unsettling, but the law was on his side. For now. The officers left, and we spent the rest of the night on edge, double-checking the locks and peering out the windows, half expecting to see him standing there again. But the yard was empty, and the street was silent. For the next few days, the man disappeared. He wasn't standing in his yard when I left for work, and he wasn't there when I came home. It was like he had vanished, and for a while Emily and I started to relax, thinking maybe the police had scared him off. But then, late one evening, I saw him again. It was a Friday and Emily had gone to bed early. I was in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, trying to unwind after a long day. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the TV and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I glanced out the window, and there he was standing at the edge of our yard, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. His figure was barely visible in the shadows, but I could see the glint of his eyes reflecting the dim light. He was watching the house again, but this time he wasn't standing in his own yard. He was on our side of the street, just a few feet from our front door. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed the police. I didn't take my eyes off him as I spoke to the dispatcher, explaining what was happening. "He's standing in our yard now," I said, my voice tight with fear. "He's not on his property anymore. You have to send someone." The dispatcher assured me that an officer was on the way, but when I looked back out the window, the man was gone again. The police arrived, but by the time they searched the area, there was no sign of him. Once again, we were left with no answers, just the creeping sense that something was horribly wrong. Over the next few nights, I didn't sleep much. Every sound made me jump, and I found myself constantly checking the windows, looking for any sign of the man. But he didn't come back, at least, not that I could see. Then, one night, everything changed. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke to the sound of a loud bang, like something had fallen over in the house. I shot up in bed, my heart racing, and glanced over at Emily, who was still fast asleep. I grabbed the baseball bat. I kept under the bed and crept out of the bedroom, my pulse thundering in my ears. The house was dark, and the air felt heavy, thick with a sense of dread. I made my way down the hall, gripping the bat tightly, and stopped at the top of the stairs. There at the bottom, standing in the foyer, was the man from across the street. He was inside the house. My blood turned to ice as I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, staring down at him. He was just standing there, staring up at me, his expression blank, his eyes cold and empty. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. The silence was suffocating, and my mind raced with fear and confusion. How had he gotten in? What did he want? Then, slowly, he took a step toward the stairs. My body finally kicked into gear, and I ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I shook Emily awake, my voice shaking as I told her what had happened. "We need to get out of here," I said, my hands trembling. "He's in the house." Emily's eyes widened in terror, and she scrambled out of bed. We grabbed our phones, not daring to go downstairs. I called the police again, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. "He's in our house," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please hurry." The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they searched the house, the man was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of how he had gotten inside. Emily and I left that night and never went back. We didn't feel safe in that house anymore, knowing that the man had been inside, watching us. We sold the house a few months later and moved to a different part of town. I don't know what happened to the man, and I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night, I still wake up to the sound of tapping at the window, and for a split second, I'm back in that house, staring into the cold, empty eyes of the man who watched us from across the street. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, a long stretch of highway winding through barren desert, with nothing but open sky and flat, cracked earth as far as the eye could see. It was a desolate, lonely road, but I'd always liked it that way. Driving alone, especially at night, had always been peaceful for me. Just the hum of the engine, the glow of the headlights cutting through the darkness, and the quiet solace of being completely by myself. I had spent the day visiting my sister in a small town about 3 hours outside the city. We'd had a nice time, catching up over lunch, and by the time I left, the sun was already setting. I wasn't worried about the late hour, though. The drive was straightforward, and my car, a beat-up old Honda, was reliable. All I had to do was stay on the highway and follow it all the way back to the city. It was just after 10 p.m. When I merged onto the highway, the road ahead stretching endlessly into the night. There were no other cars in sight, no streetlights, just the vast, empty desert and the stars twinkling faintly overhead. As I drove, I felt myself settling into a comfortable rhythm. The steady hum of the engine was soothing, and the quiet isolation of the desert felt almost calming. It was just me, the road, and the darkness. But after about an hour, the sense of peace I'd been enjoying began to shift. It started with a faint feeling of unease, like an itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't quite scratch. I couldn't explain it, but something about the road felt different, more oppressive, somehow. The darkness seemed thicker, the silence heavier. I tried to brush it off. It was late, and I was probably just tired. I turned on the radio, hoping for some music to distract me, but all I got was static. I flipped through the stations, but there was nothing. Just white noise and the occasional garbled voice cutting in and out. That's when I saw a pair of headlights in the rearview mirror. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the sudden appearance of the headlights startled me. I glanced at the mirror, squinting against the bright lights as they grew closer. The car was moving fast, much faster than I was, and within moments, it was right on my tail. I frowned, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. There was plenty of room to pass, there were no other cars, and the highway was wide open. But the driver didn't seem interested in passing. Instead, they stayed right behind me, their headlights glaring into my mirrors, blinding me. I slowed down a little, thinking they would take the hint and go around, but they didn't. If anything, they got closer, their bumper nearly touching mine. My heart began to race, and the unease I'd been feeling earlier returned, stronger now. Something wasn't right. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. But the car matched my speed, staying right on my tail. I could feel my palms growing slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel, my mind racing. Why weren't they passing? What did they want? The road stretched out in front of me, empty and dark, with no sign of an exit or rest stop. The headlights behind me were blinding, and I could barely see the road ahead. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to think of what to do. Then the car behind me swerved to the left, pulling up beside me. I glanced over, my stomach tightening with fear. The other car was an old, beat-up truck, its paint chipped and rusted. I couldn't see the driver through the tinted windows, but the way the truck was moving erratically, aggressively set off every alarm bell in my head. I kept my eyes on the road, hoping they would pass and leave me alone, but they didn't. Instead, the truck swerved closer, drifting into my lane and nearly sideswiping me. I jerked the wheel to the right, my tires screeching as I swerved to avoid them. My heart was racing now, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. What the hell was this guy doing? Was he trying to run me off the road? I sped up again, my foot pressing hard on the gas pedal. The engine roared as I accelerated, but the truck kept pace, pulling up beside me again. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins as I tried to focus on the road, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. Suddenly, the truck swerved hard to the right, slamming into the side of my car. The impact jolted me in my seat. and I struggled to keep control of the wheel as my car veered to the side. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought to steady the car, my mind racing with panic. I glanced over at the truck, trying to get a glimpse of the driver, but the windows were too dark. All I could see was the outline of the truck's front grille, illuminated by my headlights as it sped alongside me. What the hell was happening? I slammed on the brakes, hoping to slow down enough to get away from the truck, but the driver matched my speed again, pulling back in front of me and swerving wildly across both lanes. I was trapped. The road ahead stretched out endlessly, with no exits, no towns, nothing but darkness and desert. The truck continued to weave back and forth in front of me, blocking my path every time I tried to maneuver around it. My mind was racing, my heart pounding as I tried to figure out what to do. I couldn't outrun the truck, my car was too old, too slow. And I couldn't pull over, there was nowhere to go. The truck suddenly slowed down, forcing me to slam on the brakes to avoid rear-ending it. My tires screeched against the pavement, and for a moment, I thought I was going to lose control. But I managed to keep the car steady, my heart pounding in my chest as the truck continued to block the road in front of me. I had to do something. In a moment of desperation, I yanked the wheel to the right, veering off the highway and onto the dirt shoulder. My tires kicked up dust and rocks as I swerved around the truck, the rough ground rattling the car as I sped ahead. For a brief moment, I thought I had lost them. But then I saw the headlights behind me again. The truck was barreling down the shoulder, gaining on me fast. My heart leaped into my throat as I floored the gas pedal, my car bouncing over the uneven terrain. I could hear the roar of the truck's engine behind me, growing louder and louder. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart racing as I watched the truck close the distance between us. The headlights were blinding, and I could feel the vibration of the truck's engine through the ground as it sped toward me. There was no way I could outrun them on the dirt. My car wasn't built for this, and I could feel the wheels slipping, struggling for traction as I raced along the shoulder. I had to get back on the highway. With a sharp yank of the wheel, I swerved back onto the road, my tires screeching as they hit the pavement. The truck followed, its headlights flashing in my mirrors as it sped toward me. My mind was racing, my heart pounding as I tried to think of a way out. There was no exit in sight, no sign of another car, no hope of help. It was just me and the truck, alone on the highway in the middle of the night. Suddenly, the truck swerved again, pulling up beside me. I glanced over, my pulse racing with fear. The truck was close now, too close. The front bumper was inches from my car, and I could see the outline of the driver's face through the darkened window. I still couldn't make out their features, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and calculating. The truck lurched forward, slamming into the side of my car again. The impact sent me careening to the right, my tires screeching as I struggled to regain control. My car skidded across the highway, the steering wheel jerking in my hands as I fought to keep from spinning out. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to crash. But somehow I managed to steady the car, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I sped ahead. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. My car was old, and the engine was straining under the pressure. The truck was faster, more powerful, and it was clear that the driver wasn't going to stop until they ran me off the road. I had to do something, anything. As I sped down the highway, my eyes darted frantically, searching for something, anything that could help me. And then I saw it. Up ahead, the highway curved sharply to the left, and just beyond the curve, there was a steep embankment leading down into the desert. An idea formed in my mind, reckless and dangerous, but it was the only shot I had. I gripped the wheel tightly, my heart racing as I approached the curve. The truck was still right behind me, its headlights blinding in my mirrors. I could hear the roar of its engine, feel the vibrations through the ground as it gained on me. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and yanked the wheel hard to the right. My car veered off the road, skidding across the shoulder and down the embankment. The wheels bounced and jolted as I sped down the steep slope, the rough ground rattling the car as I raced through the desert. For a moment, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. The car lurched and swayed, the steering wheel jerking in my hands as I fought to keep control. But somehow, I managed to steady it, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sped across the desert floor. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck following me down the embankment. But it wasn't there. I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The truck was gone. I had lost them. I didn't stop driving until I saw the faint glow of a gas station in the distance. My body was trembling with exhaustion and fear, but I knew I couldn't stop yet. I had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between myself and the truck as possible. When I finally pulled into the gas station, I parked under the bright lights, my body still shaking from the adrenaline. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Whoever had been in that truck wasn't just messing with me. They had been trying to run me off the road, trying to hurt me. I don't know why they stopped chasing me. Maybe they hadn't expected me to veer off the road. Maybe they thought I had crashed. Or maybe they had just gotten bored. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and seemingly endless. It was late, far later than I'd intended to still be driving, and the quiet isolation of the highway had started to feel oppressive. The steady hum of my car's engine was the only sound, the headlights barely piercing the inky blackness ahead. I hadn't seen another car in miles. It wasn't the first time I'd found myself on an empty highway at night, but something about tonight felt different. The silence was too thick, the darkness too deep. I found myself glancing at the fuel gauge more often than I normally would, watching as it inched closer and closer to empty. I had passed a sign for a gas station about 5 miles back, but I hadn't seen any sign of it yet. My phone was dead, of course. I had forgotten to charge it before leaving, and it had powered off somewhere in the last hour. With no GPS and no service, I was relying on my memory and the occasional road sign to guide me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted the faint glow of a gas station sign in the distance. It was the first bit of light I'd seen in miles, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My gas tank was nearly empty, and the last thing I wanted was to be stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. As I got closer, I could see the gas station more clearly. It was an old, run-down place, one of those small, independent stations that looked like it hadn't seen an update in decades. The paint on the building was peeling, the lights flickered weakly, and the pumps were ancient, with faded logos and rusted handles. I pulled into the station, the tires of my car crunching on the gravel as I parked next to one of the pumps. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint buzzing of the flickering lights overhead. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the building. There was a small convenience store attached to the station, its windows dark and empty. No other cars were parked at the station, and there was no sign of anyone inside. I glanced at the gas pump, noting the old-fashioned design. It was the kind where you had to pay inside before filling up. With a sigh, I grabbed my wallet and stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting me as I crossed the lot toward the store. The door jingled softly as I pushed it open, the bell above it sounding far too loud in the quiet. Inside, the store was dimly lit, with shelves stocked sparsely with snacks, drinks, and random supplies. It smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. Behind the counter, an old man stood, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Evening," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Evening," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just need to fill up." The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Cash only." I pulled out a 20 from my wallet and handed it over, trying not to stare too long at his hands, which were gnarled and covered in dark, oily stains. He took the money without a word, rang it up, and handed me a receipt. "Pump one," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "Thanks," I muttered, turning to leave. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man's stare had been unnerving, and the whole place had an air of decay, like it had been forgotten by time. I tried to brush it off as nothing more than my own fatigue, but the feeling lingered. I returned to my car, inserted the nozzle into the tank, and began pumping the gas. The night was eerily still, the only sound the soft hiss of fuel flowing into the tank. I glanced around the empty station, feeling increasingly on edge. The lights continued to flicker, casting long shadows across the lot, and I found myself glancing back toward the store. The old man was standing in the window, watching me. My heart skipped a beat as I met his gaze. He was standing perfectly still, his hands resting on the counter, his eyes locked on me. There was something unsettling about the way he was looking at me, something that made my skin crawl. I quickly looked away, my hands shaking slightly as I finished pumping the gas. I replaced the nozzle and screwed the cap back on, all the while trying to ignore the weight of the man's stare. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible, but when I opened the car door and climbed in, I realized something. I hadn't used the restroom. I groaned, knowing I couldn't hold it for the rest of the drive. With a sigh, I got back out of the car and made my way toward the restroom, which was located around the side of the building. The old, rusted sign hanging above the door looked like it hadn't been replaced in years. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the old man standing in the doorway of the store. But the door was closed, and there was no sign of him. I hurried into the restroom, locking the door behind me. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed loudly, flickering occasionally, casting an eerie glow over the grimy tiles and cracked sink. The mirror above the sink was dirty, streaked with smudges and grime, and the whole place smelled faintly of mildew. I did my business quickly, eager to get back on the road, but as I washed my hands, I heard a faint sound, like the soft shuffle of footsteps just outside the door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. For a long moment, I stood there, staring at the door, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking back and forth just outside. I held my breath, the sound of my pulse thudding in my ears. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I slowly turned off the faucet, my hands trembling as I wiped them on my jeans. My mind was racing, my stomach churning with unease. Maybe it was just the old man, checking on the restroom. But something about the way the footsteps had sounded so slow, so deliberate made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It was fine. I was overreacting. I had been on the road for too long, and my nerves were frayed. I just needed to get back in the car and keep driving. I unlocked the door, my hand shaking slightly as I turned the knob. The door creaked open, and I stepped outside, glancing around the side of the building. There was no one there. The lot was empty, just as it had been before. The store's lights were still flickering weakly, and the old man was no longer visible in the window. I hurried back to my car, my heart racing as I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. The eerie silence of the gas station pressed in around me, and the darkness beyond the flickering lights seemed to close in. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and pulled out of the lot. I didn't look back. The highway stretched out in front of me, dark and endless, just as it had been before. But now, the unease I had felt earlier had grown into something sharper, something closer to fear. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man, the way he had been watching me from the window, the strange footsteps outside the restroom. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird old man and an overactive imagination, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. About half an hour later, my headlights illuminated something up ahead. A car pulled over to the side of the road. Its hazard lights were flashing, the red and yellow lights cutting through the darkness. I slowed down as I approached, debating whether to stop. There was no one standing outside the car, but as I passed, I glanced over, curious. That's when I saw him. The old man from the gas station was sitting in the driver's seat, his face illuminated by the flashing lights. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He didn't move as I passed, didn't acknowledge me at all. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. My heart leaped into my throat as I sped past, my pulse racing with fear. What was he doing out here? How had he gotten ahead of me? I hadn't seen him leave the gas station, and there were no other roads he could have taken. It didn't make sense. I pressed down on the gas, the car speeding up as I tried to put as much distance between us as possible. The unease that had been gnawing at me turned into full-blown panic, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The car was still there, its hazard lights flashing, growing smaller and smaller as I sped away. But then, after a few minutes, I saw headlights in the distance behind me. My stomach twisted with fear. It couldn't be him. It didn't make sense. But the lights were getting closer. And I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I sped up. The headlights behind me grew brighter, and within moments, the car was right behind me, tailgating me, its lights glaring in my mirrors. I glanced over my shoulder, my pulse racing, but I couldn't see the driver's face. The car swerved suddenly, pulling up beside me. My heart raced as I glanced over, my blood running cold. It was the old man. He was staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his face pale in the glow of the headlights. His lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. His car swerved closer, almost hitting mine, and I yanked the wheel to the right, my tires screeching as I tried to avoid him. Panic surged through me as I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as I sped down the highway. The old man's car swerved behind me, his headlights blinding me as he followed close behind. I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears, my hands shaking on the wheel as I tried to outrun him. The highway stretched out endlessly, with no exits, no other cars, nothing but darkness and fear. I didn't know what to do. The old man was relentless, his car swerving back and forth behind me, his headlights flashing in my mirrors. I couldn't shake him. Finally, in a moment of desperation, I yanked the wheel to the right, veering off the highway and onto a narrow dirt road. My tires skidded on the gravel, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to lose control. But somehow, I managed to steady the car, my heart racing as I sped down the road. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was still behind me. The road eventually led me to a small, rundown motel, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine and sat there, trying to catch my breath. The lot was empty, the motel quiet. I didn't see any other cars, didn't hear anything but the faint rustling of the wind. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the old man's car pulling in behind me, but the road was empty. For a long moment, I just sat there, my heart still pounding in my chest. The fear that had gripped me was still there, lingering in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the image of the old man's face, his wide, unblinking eyes, the way he had followed me, relentless and silent. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, staring at me through the darkness. I left the motel at first light, not bothering to check out. I just wanted to get back on the road, away from that stretch of highway, away from the gas station, away from the old man. I haven't taken that route since. It wasn't the kind of thing I would normally agree to. In fact, if someone had asked me a month ago if I wanted to spend the night sneaking into an abandoned amusement park, I would have said they were crazy. But there I was, standing in front of the rusted gates of Dreamland, an amusement park that had been closed for over 20 years, wondering what had possessed me to come along for the ride. It had been Ryan's idea. He was the adventurous one in our group, always looking for something thrilling or dangerous to do. "Come on, man," he'd said, grinning from ear to ear. "When's the next time you'll get a chance to check out a place like this?" The answer, of course, was never. Places like this didn't exist anymore, not the way they did when we were kids. Dreamland had been shut down long before any of us were old enough to visit, but we had heard the stories, the urban legends about accidents, about the place being haunted. People in town still talked about it sometimes, saying it wasn't just the park that was abandoned, but something worse had been left behind. None of that had deterred Ryan, though. When he found out that the old park was still standing, untouched and mostly forgotten, he had decided we had to check it out. "It's just a bit of fun," he'd said. "What's the worst that could happen?" As I stood there, staring up at the faded sign hanging crookedly over the entrance, I could think of plenty of things that could go wrong. Ryan stood beside me, bouncing on the balls of his feet like a kid about to open presents on Christmas morning. "You ready?" he asked, his grin wide. "I don't know," I muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "This place gives me the creeps." "You're just being paranoid," Ryan laughed, clapping me on the back. "Come on, it'll be fun." Emily and Sarah, the other two members of our little group, were already climbing through a gap in the fence. Emily glanced back at us, her eyes glinting with excitement. "Hurry up, you two. We don't want to get caught standing out here." Ryan and I exchanged a glance, then followed them through the fence. Once inside, the first thing that hit me was the silence. The park had once been alive with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clattering of rides. But now, it was deathly quiet. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of rust and decay, and the ground beneath our feet was littered with debris, broken glass, old candy wrappers, and pieces of twisted metal. We walked deeper into the park, our footsteps crunching loudly on the cracked pavement. The rides loomed around us like skeletal ghosts, their metal frames rusted and broken. The Ferris wheel, once the park's centerpiece, stood in the distance, its cars hanging at odd angles, swaying gently in the breeze. The roller coaster tracks twisted and turned above us like the skeleton of some long-dead beast, the cars long since removed or lost to time. This is so cool, Ryan whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Can you imagine what this place must have been like when it was still open? I can't, I admitted, my voice tight with unease. The place felt wrong, like we didn't belong here. The air was too still, the silence too thick. I kept expecting to hear something, a distant echo of laughter, the faint hum of carnival music, but there was nothing. Emily and Sarah were walking ahead of us, their voices soft as they marveled at the state of the park. They seemed completely at ease, as if they were wandering through an old museum instead of an abandoned amusement park with a reputation for being cursed. Ryan nudged me. Come on, don't be such a buzzkill. It's just an old park. No one's been here in years. I nodded, trying to push the unease from my mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just overreacting. It was, after all, just an old amusement park. What was the worst that could happen? We wandered through the park for a while, exploring the dilapidated rides and crumbling buildings. Ryan was in his element, climbing onto the rusted tracks of the roller coaster, taking pictures of the decaying attractions, and telling us stories about what the park used to be like. Emily and Sarah seemed to be enjoying themselves too, snapping photos and laughing at the absurdity of sneaking into an old, abandoned park in the middle of the night. But the longer we stayed, the more I felt like we were being watched. It was a subtle feeling at first, a prickling on the back of my neck, the sense that there were eyes on us, following our every move. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was no one. Just the empty park, shrouded in darkness and silence. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. Every time we rounded a corner or approached a new ride, I felt that same unsettling sensation, the hairs on my arms standing on end, my heartbeat quickening. It felt like the park itself was alive, watching us, waiting for something. You okay, Sarah asked, noticing my discomfort. Yeah, I said quickly, forcing a smile. I don't know. This place is weird. Weird, but cool, Ryan said, jumping down from the roller coaster tracks. Come on, I want to check out the funhouse. I grimaced. The funhouse had always been a source of local legend. It was said to be one of the first rides shut down after an accident, and according to the stories, it was cursed. There were rumors that the mirrors inside showed things that weren't really there, reflections of people who had died in the park, or glimpses of your own death. I don't know, man, I said, my stomach twisting with unease. Maybe we should stick to the other rides. Ryan rolled his eyes. What, you're afraid of a bunch of old mirrors? Come on, it's not going to hurt you. I just don't like it, I muttered. Emily and Sarah exchanged glances, but neither of them seemed particularly concerned. It's just a story, Emily said. No one's been in there for years. Exactly, Ryan added. It'll be fun. Reluctantly, I followed them as they made their way toward the funhouse. The building was still standing, though the paint was peeling and the windows were cracked. A large sign above the entrance, once bright and colorful, now hung crookedly, the letters faded and chipped. Ryan pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. He grinned at us, then disappeared inside. Emily and Sarah followed, and after a moment's hesitation, I stepped in behind them. The interior of the funhouse was just as decayed as the rest of the park. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under our feet. Broken mirrors lined the walls, their surfaces scratched and fogged with grime. The once bright paint on the walls had faded to a dull, lifeless gray, and the distorted reflections in the mirrors made the room feel even more disorienting. This is awesome, Ryan whispered, his voice echoing through the room. It's like stepping into a time capsule. I wasn't so sure. The place felt wrong, like the walls were closing in on us. The air was too still, too quiet, and the mirrors, those damn mirrors, seemed to twist and warp in ways that didn't make sense. I caught glimpses of myself in the reflections, but something was off. My reflection seemed delayed, like it was moving just a fraction of a second behind me. "Do you guys see that?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "See what Sarah asked?" Turning to look at me. "The mirrors. They're weird." Ryan laughed. "Of course they're weird, dude. They're old funhouse mirrors. They're supposed to look weird." "No, I mean," I stopped, glancing at the nearest mirror. My reflection stared back at me, but it didn't feel right. There was something in the way my eyes looked, something dark, something wrong. I stepped closer to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out, my fingers brushing the glass, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw something behind me, a shadow, just out of sight. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, silent and still. "You okay?" Emily asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "I'm fine," I lied, stepping away from the mirror. "Let's just get out of here." Ryan groaned. "Come on, we just got here." "I don't care," I snapped. "I don't like this place." Before Ryan could argue, the lights flickered. We all froze, staring up at the ceiling as the dim light bulbs sputtered and buzzed. For a moment, the room was plunged into darkness, and I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. Then, just as suddenly, the lights flickered back on. But something was different. The mirrors, there were more of them. They had shifted, multiplying, filling the room until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. My own reflection stared back at me from a dozen angles, each one distorted, twisted in ways that made my skin crawl. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we need to get out of here." Ryan didn't argue this time. He glanced around the room, his eyes wide with fear. "Where's the door?" I turned, my heart racing. The door we had come through, it was gone. The walls were lined with mirrors, reflecting endless versions of ourselves, but the exit had disappeared. Panic surged through me as I ran toward the nearest wall, my hands slamming against the cold glass. My reflection mimicked me, its eyes wide and terrified, but there was no door, no way out. "This isn't right," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be real." "Keep looking," Ryan shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "There has to be a way out." We fanned out, frantically searching the walls, but every mirror we touched just reflected our own fear back at us. The room seemed to be shrinking, the air growing colder and thicker with each passing second. The mirrors, those horrible mirrors, seemed to close in on us, their distorted reflections warping and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in one of the mirrors. I turned to look, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a split second, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the reflection, just behind me, but when I spun around, there was no one there. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Guys, I think we're not alone." "What are you talking about?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. "There's something in here with us," I whispered. Before I could say anything else, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. The air was thick with the sound of our panic breathing, and I could feel the walls closing in, the mirrors multiplying, reflecting nothing but darkness. Then, in the silence, I heard it, a soft whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of it, the cadence, the tone, it was wrong. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. The lights flickered back on, and I froze. There, in the mirror, was the figure. It was standing behind us, its form dark and shadowy, its face hidden in the distorted reflection. I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest, and as I watched, it took a step forward. I turned, but again, there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the mirrors reflecting our fear back at us. "We need to go," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "We can't," Ryan shouted. "The door is gone." "We have to do something," Sarah cried. "We can't stay here." I backed away from the mirrors, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Then, as if in answer to my prayers, the lights flickered one last time, and the door appeared. Without hesitation, we ran for it, our footsteps echoing through the room as we bolted for the exit. I didn't look back, didn't glance at the mirrors as we fled. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We burst through the door, stumbling out into the cool night air. I collapsed to the ground, my hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. The park was silent, the rides looming around us like skeletal ghosts. But we were alive. We had made it out. I glanced back at the funhouse, my heart still racing. The door was still there, standing slightly ajar. But the mirrors, they were gone. It had been months since I'd taken any time off. The routine of work had worn me down, and I needed an escape, a break from the constant buzz of the city. So I did what I always did when life felt overwhelming. I packed up my car, grabbed my camping gear, and hit the road. There was something soothing about the open highway, the freedom of going anywhere, with no real destination in mind. Just me, my car, and the vast countryside stretching out in all directions. The plan was simple. I'd drive until I found a secluded spot, somewhere off the beaten path, and set up camp for a night or two. No distractions, no deadlines, just the peaceful quiet of nature. I'd been driving for most of the day, the sun hanging low in the sky by the time I found what seemed like the perfect spot, a small clearing just off a lonely stretch of road. It was remote, quiet, and surrounded by dense woods. The kind of place where you wouldn't hear or see another soul for miles. Exactly what I was looking for. I pulled the car over, parked near the tree line, and got out, breathing in the cool evening air. The quiet was immediate, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. A sense of calm washed over me as I took in the surroundings. This was exactly what I needed. After unloading my gear, I set up the tent, built a small fire, and settled in for the evening. The sun had nearly set by the time I finished, casting the sky in shades of deep purple and orange. I made myself a quick dinner over the fire, the warmth of the flames a welcome comfort against the cool night air. By the time the stars began to appear, the world around me had fallen into complete silence. I leaned back in my camping chair, staring up at the clear, star-filled sky. It was breathtaking. No city lights, no traffic, just endless stars twinkling above me, stretching on forever. For a while, I just sat there, enjoying the solitude. There was something so peaceful about being alone in the woods, away from everything. The fire crackled softly, and I felt my body relax, the tension of the last few months slowly melting away. But as the night deepened and the fire began to die down, An uneasy feeling crept into the back of my mind. It was subtle at first, like a faint prickling sensation on the back of my neck, but it was enough to make me sit up a little straighter. I glanced around the clearing, my eyes scanning the darkness just beyond the glow of the fire. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. There was no one out here but me. I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. Still, the sense of unease lingered. I glanced over at the fire, noticing that it had burned down to a smoldering heap of embers. With a sigh, I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, deciding it was time to call it a night. I doused the fire with dirt and water, making sure it was fully out, then made my way to the tent. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead as I approached the tent. The night was eerily quiet now, with even the wind having died down. The only sound was the soft crunch of leaves under my boots as I walked. I unzipped the tent, crawled inside, and zipped it up behind me. The thin walls of the tent made the outside world feel a little too close for comfort, but I told myself it was fine. I'd been camping before, plenty of times. There was nothing out there. I laid down on my sleeping bag, pulling it up to my chest as I stared up at the nylon ceiling. The tent felt small and claustrophobic in the dark, but I forced myself to relax. I needed sleep. It had been a long day, and I had another drive ahead of me tomorrow. For a while, I just lay there, listening to the quiet. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves outside, and I could hear the faint creaking of branches swaying in the breeze. It was peaceful, but the sense of unease I'd felt earlier hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. And then I heard it. A soft crunch, like the sound of footsteps, just outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I strained to listen, every muscle in my body tense. There was again a slow, deliberate crunch, like someone or something was walking through the clearing. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. An animal, maybe? A deer. It had to be. There were no other people out here. No one even knew I was here. But the footsteps, they sounded too heavy, too deliberate. Another crunch. Closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the switch. The tent was silent now, but I could feel the presence outside something, or someone was out there. I clicked the flashlight on, the beam casting a faint glow inside the tent. I waited, listening, my breath shallow and uneven. Nothing, just silence. I was about to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing when there was a sudden, sharp tap against the side of the tent. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat as I scrambled to sit up. The tap came again, softer this time, followed by another, and another like fingers tapping against the nylon fabric. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, my hand trembling as the beam illuminated the side of the tent. The tapping stopped, and for a long moment, everything was still. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the tapping resumed, this time louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was trying to get in. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Should I call out? Should I get out of the tent and make a run for it? Before I could make a decision, the tapping stopped. Silence. My heart pounded in my ears as I waited, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I just sat there, staring at the side of the tent, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. Then, without warning, the zipper on the front of the tent began to move. It was slow at first, the faint sound of the zipper being pulled open inch by inch, but it was unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I stared at the zipper, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone was unzipping the tent. I bolted upright, the flashlight clattering to the ground as I grabbed the zipper and yanked it back up, sealing the tent. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I grabbed the flashlight again, shining it around the inside of the tent, as if that would somehow protect me. The sound of the zipper stopped, but the presence outside hadn't gone away. I could feel it, hear it. The soft crunch of footsteps circling the tent, slow and deliberate. Whatever was out there, it was toying with me. I had to get out. I couldn't just sit there and wait for it to come back. I grabbed my boots, my hands shaking as I slipped them on. My mind raced, trying to plan my next move. The car was parked about 30 feet away, just beyond the tree line. If I could make it to the car, I could lock myself inside, start the engine, and get the hell out of there. But first I had to get out of the tent. I reached for the zipper, my hand trembling as I slowly began to pull it down. The tent was silent now, no footsteps, no tapping, but I knew that whatever was out there was still watching, waiting. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and yanked the zipper the rest of the way down. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face as I crawled out of the tent, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the clearing. Nothing. The clearing was empty, just as it had been when I set up camp. The trees stood silent, the wind rustling softly through the leaves. There was no sign of whatever or whoever had been outside the tent. I took a step forward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The car was just ahead, sitting in the darkness like a beacon of safety. If I could just make it to the car, I'd be okay. I started walking, my footsteps crunching softly on the ground as I made my way toward the tree line. My eyes darted around the clearing, searching the shadows for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the trees in the dark. I was almost at the car when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from the woods. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound was faint, but it was there, something moving in the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I shone the flashlight toward the sound, my pulse racing as I took a step back. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but I couldn't see anything. Whatever was making the noise was staying just out of sight. The growling grew louder, more intense, and I could hear the soft rustle of leaves as something moved toward me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, as the flashlight flickered, its beam weakening. "Come on," I muttered, shaking the flashlight in a desperate attempt to keep it from going out. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, its form hidden in the shadows. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were wrong, bent at odd angles. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I turned and bolted for the car, my legs burning as I sprinted across the clearing. The growling grew louder, the sound of something moving through the trees chasing after me. I could hear it getting closer, the pounding of its footsteps echoing in my ears. I reached the car, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it, the engine roaring to life. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I locked the doors and threw the car into reverse. The headlights illuminated the clearing, and for a brief moment, I saw it. The figure stood at the edge of the trees, its body hunched, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes gleamed in the light, and its mouth, if it was a mouth, hung open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I hit the gas, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped out of the clearing and back onto the road. My hands shook on the wheel, my heart racing as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing after me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the darkness behind me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, hours later. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me, waiting for me to stop. I've never gone camping alone since that night. And I never will again. The idea of spending a weekend in an isolated cabin seemed perfect at the time. I had been craving solitude, a break from the constant notifications and noise of my daily life. Work had been relentless, and I felt like I hadn't had a moment to breathe in weeks. So when I stumbled upon the listing for a remote cabin rental miles away from the nearest town, tucked deep in the woods, it felt like exactly what I needed. The photos of the cabin were idyllic, a small, rustic structure nestled among towering pines, a wood-burning fireplace, and a wraparound porch with views of the surrounding forest. The host, a man named Peter, assured me in the listing that the cabin was the ultimate getaway for anyone seeking peace and quiet. That's exactly what I was after. The drive out to the cabin took longer than expected. The directions from Peter had been straightforward enough, but as I wound deeper into the woods, the road narrowed, turning into a dirt path that was barely wide enough for my car. My GPS signal cut out about an hour before I arrived, leaving me to rely solely on the hand-drawn map Peter had provided. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp and cool, and the silence was immediate, no distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I parked the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath. The cabin looked even better in person, small and cozy, with a warm glow coming from the windows. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and headed inside. The interior of the cabin was exactly as advertised, rustic and charming, with a stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom in the back. The windows overlooked the dense forest, and the porch looked like the perfect place to sit and sip coffee in the morning. After unpacking, I made myself a quick dinner and settled in for the night. I lit a fire in the fireplace and curled up on the couch with a book, the crackling of the fire and the soft glow of the flames creating the perfect atmosphere for relaxation. By the time I headed to bed, I was feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. The bed was comfortable, and as I lay there, listening to the gentle rustling of the trees outside, I felt myself drifting off into a deep, peaceful sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to complete darkness. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The fire in the living room had long since died down, leaving the cabin cold and dark. I sat up in bed, blinking into the darkness, trying to shake off the disorientation of being jolted awake. Then I heard a faint noise, like the creak of floorboards coming from the living room. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained to listen. The cabin was silent now, the only sound the soft whisper of wind against the windows. I told myself it was nothing, just the old cabin settling, or maybe a branch brushing against the roof. but the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach wouldn't go away. I reached for my phone, fumbling with it in the darkness. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow across the room, but there was no signal. I hadn't expected there to be. Peter had warned me that the cabin was too remote for cell service, but the lack of connection only made the cabin feel more isolated, more vulnerable. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was overreacting. It was just an old cabin in the middle of the woods. I was alone. No one knew I was here. But that thought only made me feel worse. I got out of bed, slipping on my shoes and grabbing the flashlight I had packed, just in case. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I stepped into the hallway, making my way toward the living room. The cabin was quiet, the floor creaking softly under my feet as I walked. The fire had completely died out, leaving the room cold and still. I shone the flashlight around the room, my heart pounding in my chest. But everything looked as it should: the couch, the small table, the stack of firewood near the hearth. Nothing was out of place. I was just about to turn back to bed when I heard it again. A creak. Louder this time, definitely coming from inside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned, shining the flashlight toward the kitchen. The beam of light flickered as it swept across the small room, illuminating the old wooden cabinets and the worn countertops. Nothing. But then I saw it. The back door, the one that led out to the porch, was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stared at the door, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I had locked it before going to bed. I was sure of it. I had checked all the doors before turning in for the night. But now the door was open, just a crack, as if someone had been inside. I took a step back, my mind racing. Someone was out there. Someone had been in the cabin while I was asleep. For a long moment, I just stood there, frozen, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't heard anyone, hadn't seen anything, but the door was open. The flashlight flickered again, and I fumbled with it, my hands trembling as I tried to steady the beam. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. Now. I backed away from the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way toward the front door. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, my mind racing with panic. I had to get out of here. I didn't know what was out there, but I couldn't stay. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it, a low, creaking sound coming from the porch. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone was out there, on the porch. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't go out there. Not with someone waiting on the other side. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I needed to think. I needed to stay calm. But the cabin felt like it was closing in on me. The walls too close, the darkness too thick. I turned and ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, turning it with trembling fingers. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I grabbed my phone again. No signal, of course. I paced the small room, my mind racing. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't leave. I was trapped. The cabin was silent now, but I knew that whatever or whoever was outside hadn't gone away. I could feel it. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get out of this. For what felt like hours, I just sat there listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. My mind raced with possibilities. Had it been an animal, a person? Was someone watching me? Or had I imagined the whole thing? Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself that it was all in my head, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window. I turned, the flashlight beam flickering as I shone it toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could hear it clearly now. Tap, 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 like fingers gently tapping against the glass. My blood ran cold. Someone was outside the window. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I stared at the window, my mind screaming at me to run, to hide, to do something, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then the tapping stopped. Silence. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something to happen. The flashlight beam flickered again, casting long shadows across the room, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the doorknob twist. Inch by inch, the soft creak of the wood echoing through the room. I backed away, my mind racing with panic. The door was locked, but it wouldn't hold for long. Whoever was outside, they were trying to get in. I grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and jammed it under the doorknob, my hands shaking as I shoved it into place. The doorknob rattled again, more insistently this time, but the chair held. For now. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and grabbed my phone again, my fingers trembling as I stared at the screen. No signal. Still no signal. The rattling stopped, and for a long moment there was silence again. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but I could hear it clearly. Let me in. My blood turned to ice. The voice was faint, almost melodic, but there was something wrong about it, something unnatural. Let me in, the voice whispered again, this time more insistent. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice continued, whispering softly, repeating the same words over and over again. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice seemed to echo in my head, growing louder and louder with each repetition. Let me in. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the window, pulling the curtains aside and throwing it open. The cold night air hit me like a wave as I scrambled out, landing hard on the ground below. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The forest closed in around me, the trees towering overhead as I sprinted through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear the voice, faint now, carried on the wind. Let me in. I kept running, my legs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't look back at the cabin as I sped down the dirt road, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't care what was behind me. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. Hours later, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and parked under the bright lights, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I haven't been back to the cabin since.